We have about 15, 20 minutes to have some concluding conversation and thoughts. I want to remind everyone before we sit and do that to stay with us for our opportunity to continue these conversations in more informal ways at our reception that will be downstairs at, I will say at this point, 5:05. Where there'll be a little bit of food, wine, and I am told by Katie, cocktails as well. So good way to end our week. So with that, though, I'd like to invite Lars and Maurice to join me up front to maybe have some, closing remarks and take some questions. Questions could be directed here, could be directed towards our Detroit panel from earlier as well. We just wanted to be able to wrap up with almost where we've begun, which was with the two of you having a conversation and then stopping me in the hall and saying, how do we do this? So.
Is this? Yeah. Okay, this is working. I mean, this whole endeavor to start a housing conversation really started in 2016, and with the informal discussion, of course, between both of us, is the excitement of bringing Detroit on the map, and I think we have done that nationally and almost internationally. With the work of the college and all the participants of the studios, several hundred students have contributed to this, and this is not trivial. It's a really important aspect of it, and I think it can grow to a tradition in housing excellence. I think the discussion which we had today started an enormous amount of energy, I think, to discuss domesticities, the urban design, any kind of these topics.
Yeah, no, wow. I had a hunch that Detroit could position itself to break open this question of how do you rebuild housing given the kind of Midwestern context of which Detroit exemplifies it, where land, an abundance of it, so you can take the issue of some of the coast issues of land off the table. The question of density, that's going to be in somewhere in between, the high-rise and the single family, that kind of missing middle density, and then the financing, the idea that indeed everything that gets built in Detroit requires public financing, and that could create the kind of perfect storm for experimentation. I like the use today of the idea that piloting ideas and the ability from the position that I held to be able to take the public commissions and let them be the place where you could take certain risk. Because I think we all know that the development community and those who finance development are risk adverse. And so I had a hunch that the public could afford to mess around with these questions a little. And so whether it was City Modern or the Weigel project that you showed, or La Jolla in Mexican Town, these were an opportunity for us to establish the conversation. And I thought the work today gave evidence that those were some of the right questions about courtyards and plazas, holes and keyholes, and all of these issues that drive home the question about how do we live together, how do we make community, and what were going to be the components that would force this question. And I feel really, really strongly that the urban design lens, the planning policy lens, has helped to crack open this question. And I thought the last panel and the question of domesticity is still a frontier that I feel we have to push on. And only now are we beginning to see opportunities to talk about how we live domestically. And it's not going to be the conventional developer-driven housing where the experimentation is going to happen. So, for example, artists live-work housing are breaking open that question just because of the way that artists work and the fact that it has to be delivered so cheaply. So the developers who are playing with that are not your typical developers. They are clearly on the margins in the less popular places. And I even think that even though you didn't show it, I know Volume 1 was trying to work on this quadruplex model in the villages where it basically questioned, do you need to have a complete kitchen with all of its appliances, or can you just have a slab and a sink and an outlet? And the rest you get from the Lowe's or wherever you buy your stuff, or do you really need closets? Or can you just have a place to hang something? So I'm really intrigued by pushing on that question. And I do think that the question of typology has helped us force this issue a bit further. I was, intrigued to see Beth and the early experimentation in the Muse houses and just what it means to cut holes into the unit and all of a sudden set up entirely different relationships of domesticity. I think we need more on that level, and I'm looking and hoping that this kind of developers on the margin will allow us to play in that space more. But I feel incredibly proud with the how much we've been able to push a conversation about the public realm, about all of those spaces in between public and private in the work that's in the pipeline now in Detroit.
It's probably just a good moment to, I spoke a lot at the beginning, so I'm not going to speak again, but to maybe open to some final questions from the audience, or, yeah, any, I think Mark is way back there, but I don't know where our box is hiding. Ah, Kit has the box.
But I'm not going to throw it.
So much of the Detroit housing stock is single family and maybe not so well constructed from the 40s to the 50s and early 60s. And I'm just wondering if you and Lars and others have thought about how that experimentation works with the reigning typology in Detroit. There'll be infill, there'll be new construction, but I think at the end of the day, the majority of the housing will still be primarily that. And just wondering if the studio addresses that, or if planning has thought about, let's say 10, 15 years from now, what those houses look like.
Maybe if I may answer first. We're doing a lot of work with the students with the highest possible density. But this has something to do, of course, not only with urbanism and typology and what we want to explore in multifamily housing and systems, but also, I guess, as a reaction to the discussions with the city, with the planning department, and economic realities in the city that smaller projects just don't pan out. You have to have a certain critical mass before it becomes really feasible. And so in that regard, I think, at least from my perspective at the moment, it works really hand in hand.
I think that because we don't really need to build any more new single-family detached housing, the question on the table has been how do we tweak the housing rehab formula so that it can create new opportunities for how people live. And I think this too, every one of them is an experiment, but the area that we've designated first in, and we're starting to see what those tweaks look like, is the Fitzgerald neighborhood, which promises to rehab 100 homes with a wide range of affordability and site sizes. And so one thing, a couple of the folks who bought these houses, and they all range in kind of 50 to 70,000. Costs twice that amount to produce them. But the first buyers are people who, one, would like to operate a home business. So we were wondering about that because we were talking about changing the zoning that would allow live work to happen in an R1 exclusive neighborhood. So we're going to try these first users who want to operate a business out of their home. The second is the urban ag component, where because we've been able to aggregate lots next to the rehabbed house to that house, the first urban ag occupant, buyer, has the new house and has 3 lots on which they will be growing food and being able to sell that on the property. And so there are just 2 examples that we're learning from to see if we need to take this to scale. I know that we've explored different models of bundling the house with the lots, and it gets a little bit too, I don't know if it'll produce a group kitchen, but in Banglatown, the Bangladeshi community in that part of Detroit have been taking care of vacant lots and growing things for as long as they've been there. And so we're experimenting with a house plus 2 to 9 lots bundled and sold to a number of nonprofits who do kind of farm to table work. And so I was intrigued by the communal kitchen conversation and whether it was, a domestic typology or whether it was this hybrid business entrepreneurial model. So I think it's the fact that it's just rehab and it's not new construction, and that we can deliver the rehab plus varying degrees of adjacent lots is going to be a place to experiment. And as I said, zoning will be able to enable it. It's very challenging to go into a neighborhood and say we're going to zone 100 houses so they can all have home-based businesses. Because there are still hundreds of other families who live there who don't think that they don't trust that. But doing an experiment, doing a half a dozen of them and seeing what kinds of businesses emerge over time is just a part of the necessity of how we can make those changes. Again, getting back to this idea, it's really just an experiment. We don't know if it's going to work before we go ahead and change everything.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with you, Maurice, especially about some of the implications of your response to Mark just now. And you brought up maybe more directly than anyone else has so far, just the issue of the relationship of these wonderful aspirations contained in these great designs and the reality of the Detroit economy. And I think there is a kind, floating around is this kind of idea that if we create this beautiful, exciting place, that somehow that will create or somehow lead to the economy that can support it. I wonder about that, let's put it that way. And I was wondering, at this point, where you're about to move to a much more dynamic economy, how do you see the reality of the Detroit economy that you're leaving, the kind of economic basis of the city that that we're going to have to live with?
Yeah. I think there was an enormous burst of energy and enthusiasm and a sense of anything is possible. And many developers charged out and started putting together ideas that I thought really pushed the envelope and may have actually been a little ahead of the curve. And I think of one of the projects that Abir didn't present, but it's Baltimore Station 2, which tries to put co-living micro-units and one-bedroom apartments for sale and for rent, all within the same building. It's currently just a hole in the ground, and they've stopped construction because the financing still had not caught up with the model. And so I feel really strongly that there are a lot of projects in the pipeline that are ahead of the capacity to deliver. And so I think we're going to have the benefit of time in terms of things slowing down, and I think Detroit will have a better chance to get it right because there's not going to be a massive flood in the market here. So I always, the one thing that I gives me some concern about moving to a city like Chicago is in Detroit we have had the luxury of time. We are having to induce markets, not chase after they had already discovered a place. And that opportunity to experiment and then the opportunity to reflect and analyze is still something that Detroit is positioned to do. And I think that the housing studio, the idea that we were able to propose a form-based code in Brush Park, have time for a full semester of an academic seminar to analyze the code, then change the code as a result of the discovery that students had before we actually took it to City Council. I mean, where else do you get a chance to pace the work that way? So I think that will continue as long as this partnership continues to be robust. So the first thing was to get Detroit to feel comfortable with the idea of the city and the neighborhood as a laboratory, as a place to experiment. And then to have those relationships between the academy, the practitioners, and the city to implement, to actually try something. And I think that's where we are. It's a very, very healthy place to be. And so I don't know, I still think that Detroit has found a place in this kind of whole conversation nationally around housing experimentation. I think it's going to be like this for a fairly long time. And I think that is going to be its inherent advantage. It's going to be affordable for a very long time. And I've said it before, a city that controls this much land controls its destiny. So we still have to work on how to make these performers pencil. But when you hold the land and every project requires a public subsidy, you control the future. And so I'm really, really hopeful in that regard.
So I think we've pretty much exhausted our time, but I just wanted to make one concluding remark, which is as someone who spent 18 years in Chicago, before moving to Ann Arbor and engaging our sort of academic context here, one of the things when I arrived here that I was most worried about was the legacy and my knowledge of the legacy of Chicago as treating the city as an academic exercise or laboratory for experimentation on the part of the university. And I think one of the things that, both also to answer one of Mark's questions, that we've been sort of fortunate here as a very large research university, and quite frankly at a distance from Detroit, is that it also gives us a little bit of distance, so that, of course, today we've been talking about one studio among lots and lots of studios that take place here that explore questions like, I know we looked at Fitzgerald in a studio at one point. There's studios that look at the Beltline, that look at the Dekinder Cut, that look at water systems, that look at so many things, and that's before we even get to what the urban planning students are doing in their capstones. But one of the things that's been really special about this is being able to leverage the scale of our endeavor here at Taubman College, the hands and minds of our students and faculty, but with an actual willing partner. So we're not doing this in a vacuum, per se. We're not, scheming this up. The actual experimenter in this whole equation is the city, and not, well, we're doing a lot of experimenting, which is great, but that is enabled by a conversation that I have to say, having taught in this context for many years in Chicago and many years in New York, it's just pretty impossible to have that conversation. And so the way in which we've operated, I hope, continues, because it takes an activation and an active relationship between the city and the university to be able to do this kind of work, not just in the studio here, but so many of the other studios that we're doing, in which the city and many of its agencies and nonprofits also participate with us. I just want to thank everyone who's been here in and out over the course of the day with that final note. Once again, thank Lars and Maurice for proposing this in the first place, and to all of our speakers over the course of the day. And I can only say, look forward to more conversation on this, and hopefully a publication, and work that's going to continue. It's really important.
No, thank you for being here.